Okay, so we're going to continue talking about evolution. We've hit on natural selection a little bit, and we talked a little bit about artificial selection in our last lecture. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about a little bit more details about all of this. I'm starting here with an animation or two to kind of give you a better frame of reference as we go into my lecture. And so in this particular animation, they're using a make-believe animal that appears to look kind of like a rock. And it will change its appearance based on natural selection. Again, natural selection is when nature is doing the selecting. It may be the easiest examples is things like predators eating littler animals that are obvious and seen in the environment, while animals that are more camouflaged aren't seen. So that's an example of fitness. So the camouflaged animal survives. When it reproduces, it's going to look a little bit more, it's going to look like its ancestors, the most recent one being their parents. In this video, you'll see them bouncing together, and that's their reproduction. Again, this is just kind of a hypothetical example, but all you have to do is look around in real nature and you'll see stick insects. When you see a stick insect walking along a tree this fall, because they're out now, well, I mean, its environment is living in trees and looking like a branch and not being eaten by foxes and birds and coyotes and things that will take advantage of it. Those animals do eat insects occasionally. And so anyway, let's watch this little hypothetical video, and I'll kind of point out a few things as this is going. Again, these are particularly short ones. I'll give you longer ones for your homework.
This is Lithopodius Nulla, a simple creature with a tendency, like any other species, to reproduce offspring. Lots of offspring. Although the offspring inherit many characteristics of their parents, no two individuals in the population.
So these are all supposed to be the same species. They are obviously into reproduction like every other animal and life form, for the most part, that is sexual. I mean, there are asexual life forms as well. And evolution still occurs with those, of course. And so you see there's a variation. So even like in your own family, there are variation. There's some people, you know, your brother might be taller than you. Different, you know, so we see people all around, and there's different variations in people. It's just an easy example. We see this in all species of animals as well, like dogs, for instance. Just about everything you can imagine, there's a variation. They're not all identical clones for the most part. Now, there are some species where we do have clones of their parents, and these tend to be asexual. So actually evolution works faster in animals with sexual reproduction. So let's see what happens when natural selection selects based on a predator eating these animals. Which ones stand out? Is it the green ones, or is it this little brown one? Which ones stand out? What is going to be more easily seen by a predator and eaten? If they are eaten, they don't have time to reproduce. Species of animals and plants, for that matter, or anything, tend to reproduce at high rates. Yet the actual survival, you know, imagine even with something you might be familiar with, a cat might have 10 or 15 kittens. If it's living out in nature, not many of them are going to survive. And so that's true when you have birds, you have true when you have laying insects. It's really true when you lay fish. Fish lay thousands of eggs, and maybe, or turtles. You've seen sea turtle videos maybe, where a sea turtle may have literally a clutch of 50 eggs per turtle or more. And they're all trying to run from the beach onto the water. The first thing that's happening, they get eaten by birds. The next thing that's happening, they get eaten by sea creatures. And by the time the turtle makes its final age, a sea turtle that can come back and reproduce, Out of that clutch of 50, maybe only a couple have survived. Some of that survival is going to be due to attributes of that individual. Maybe they can run a little faster and get off into the water, or hide a little bit better, be a little more camouflage. Sometimes it's just luck too, who survives and who doesn't. So let's watch this video some more.
Population are exactly the same. This variation is vital to the survival of the species, as only a fraction of the Lithopodius will actually survive long enough to reproduce themselves. As a result, only those with characteristics that are best suited for survival in the environment will pass on these successful traits to the next generation. Those with characteristics less.
So what we're seeing is a change in the population over time. Here we had a population with a lot of different colored individuals. A lot of them were selected against, they were eaten at a higher rate. It might not be, it's not necessarily an all or nothing thing. It might just be a smaller increase in being eaten. Leaving behind, and this group that looks different than the overall original population. So remember, evolution takes place in a population over time. So this could be, this little picture here could represent, hundreds of years of selection. Even though this animation makes it look like it just happened in one moment. This kind of stuff takes place over hundreds and hundreds of generations or thousands of generations.
Suited to the environment are less likely to survive and reproduce. This process is called natural selection, and over time and generations, it leads to the build-up of favorable characteristics in the population of a species.
So it's getting even more extreme, or the other ones that were even more camouflaged, because when the population included all those other colored individuals, this one survived. But now, with this extreme selection towards this rock-like camouflage, this one's the one that stands out, while the more rock ones are still being avoided or not being eaten at the same rate.
The result is a transformation of a population over time to suit its environment. This is known as adaptation.
So this extreme selection becomes adaptation, where it really fits its environment. Now, not all animals survive of selection. Some animals, when they can't adapt, become extinct. In fact, most species of animals that lived on Earth are now extinct. That might be kind of mind-blowing when you look around, but think about what little we even know from the fossil record of animals that no longer exist, from mammoths and mastodons to dinosaurs to cave bears, the giant sloths. Those are just things that we know. Can you imagine all the little animals that never made it into the fossil record very well? Or even large animals that didn't make it. Most animals don't make it to being a fossil. So after multiple generations, lots of selection has taken place, and now we have an adaptation where this species is very camouflaged for this desert-like environment. But what happens if the environment changes? We know that climate change happens. It's not just now. It's not just human-helped climate change, which is happening now. Climate change has also occurred when humans weren't around as well. I mean, we're speeding up aspects of our climate. It's just simple facts when you look at, just go drive down some highways. But climate change also occurs to non-human stuff. I mean, when we had all those forest fires in California last week, even our skies still look pretty cloudy right now and hazy from the forest fires that were out in California. And you see the big red sun at sunset. It looks bigger, and it's easy to look at the sun the last couple of days because of all the smoke that came from the forest fires. That's a kind of a climate change, small one. My point, though, is the environment changes. So we know we've had ice ages, for instance, where mammoths and mastodons and Neanderthals reigned. The environment changes. Places that used to be deserts become savannas, and savannas can become rainforests, and rainforests can eventually become desolate. There's even parts on, we can find seashells and things like that even in Kansas, when there's times when there's oceans that were around. So the environment's always changing. It's really slow in regards to human life, but over thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, the environment changes. So what happens when this environment changes? Will this adaptation, this camouflage that we see here, work in a grassy area?
Environmental pressures can also change.
So realize, even though this individual has that rock camouflage, there still may be some of that variation that still exists, even though they might reproduce and have mostly camouflaged rock-like animals, whatever their fictional name was. Where does this variation come from? We haven't got into this much, but it comes from what we call mutations. Mutations are things that happen where your genes might make a different, genes and DNA can be altered and make proteins a little different. And when they make proteins a little different, things start to behave differently. There could be genes that might give you a little bit more melanin, might make your hair curly versus not curly, might make scales on a reptile more feathery-like. These are all examples of mutations. Now here we see the environment's changing.
But as long as variation in a population exists...
Did you hear that one key? As long as variation exists in the population, you can have natural selection. If they all had evolved just to be this brown color, then this species could go extinct. That's one of the benefits of having variety in a species. And one of the big issues when you don't have enough variety, some animals, for instance, like cheetahs, have lost a lot of their genetic diversity. And in losing a lot of that genetic diversity, it actually could affect their evolution in a way that may not allow them to have the variety that's needed to survive if the environment changes dramatically. So variation is important for survival of a species. Again, where do you get most of that variation? Through mutations, but mutations are still rare events. It takes a long time for a mutation to occur, and then in most cases, those mutations are harmful. But in certain circumstances, the variation might make an elephant more hairy and survive a wintry environment. But if they don't have the variation, they could go extinct.
New adaptations can occur, ensuring the survival of the species.
So now, what was an adaptation that worked well in an environment that was dry is now a detrimental situation when the environment became wet and green. So that's something I want you to impress upon. Sometimes an adaptation that works great in one environment and is sucky in another environment. And so what did the population, so the population shifted from a brown color to a green color. The original population seemed to have all sorts of varieties. The environment became more deserty. The desert animals survived. Then the environment became savannas and grasslands. Then the green variety survived. So that is how natural selection worked. At least in this particular case, it was really obvious from this example of birds. But remember, environmental selection can also be temperature. Being a furry elephant in a cold environment, we call them a mastodon or mammoth, was an adaptation to that ice age. Ice age disappears, the mastodons disappear. We don't know exactly why, but we can have some ideas. Okay, so I know I've talked about artificial selection and natural selection. Let's see, artificial selection, which is human-driven interest in whatever the animal is, where we're selecting the traits that appeal to us and our needs or our wants, bolster evidence for natural selection. For instance, these two breeds of dogs, these extremes, we have here our Great Dane and our Chihuahua, are examples of how we could take a wolf-like animal, a wolf evolved, the idea is dogs evolved from wolves. They were animals that had a natural tameness to them and willing to be close to humans without causing a lot of aggression. Because what happens if we have animals with a lot of aggression there is we're not going to make friends with them. So animals that could act pleasant and like to eat on our scraps, because humans leave scraps and trash around. Those were the predecessors to becoming dogs. They have puppy-like traits. If you look at wolves and they got the floppy ears and stuff like that. I mentioned this a little bit before. But these extremes, here we got a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. Huge selection that we even put on these animals. And then if you become, a dog breeder, you focus on these traits. You have dog litters that are sired by the type of mates that you think are quality dogs and examples for that particular breed. We didn't have Chihuahuas running across Africa taking down antelopes. We invented these animals for all practical purposes to fit in our purses. Or we wanted a dog that could pull a sled, or we wanted a dog that could be a good guard dog or a shepherd dog. We even selected their behaviors. If you want a dog that's really good at following a blood trail, you're going to look at your bloodhounds and other types of sporting dogs. So sometimes you see these breeds and you're like, wow, how do they train them to do that? Obviously, training is a big part of it, but the breeding and the domestication was also a big part of it. You can't make a Chihuahua become this great pointer sporting dog. You might be able to get them to do a little chasing of a rat or something, but what I'm trying to get at. This is also true for plants, all these different kinds of mustard families. This is what a wild mustard looked like, and it was bred to become cabbage and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and kale and broccoli. These are all part of that same family, but it's, again, human selection to make food sources. So again, the idea of natural selection versus artificial selection, here we have this bird, like we saw in the video, picking out caterpillars that's more easy to see, while the caterpillars that are more camouflaged stay hidden. So the breeder selects traits that are desired, while natural selection, the environment selected. In this case, the environment. One example is the predator, but there's countless possible examples. So what are the tenets of evolution? Well, the tenets of evolution include that variation exists in a population. Again, genes are the underlying reason for that because they're the blueprints for this variation. And so looking at these snails, for instance, there's lots of different varieties. Looking at your brothers and family members, there's different traits. People just looking around a classroom, you can see there's people that are very tall, not very tall, so forth. A lot of that is influenced by genes. We like to think it's, somebody's appearance is based on only their good traits of exercise and dieting, but a lot of it is due to genes that influence that. That variation is often passed on. So like produces like. If you have a lot of tall parents, you're more likely to have a tall child, for instance. If you're a camouflaged insect, you're going to more, and you survived, you're going to likely pass on that trait. All populations overproduce. Some animals don't overproduce as much, like humans. We're more careful about not over reproducing. But we invest so much more into child care. So some animals don't invest in hardly anything. So they're throwing out thousands of eggs like a salmon or a fly. No child care is really provided by those organisms. And only a small fraction will survive. We call that R-selected if you're interested from an ecological perspective. K-selected is when an animal puts in a lot of care, but it still can lead to overreproduction. And the idea is that most of these individuals will not survive. But some that may have some traits that help them survive are more likely to reproduce. So out of all those salmon eggs, thousands of eggs, some are going to survive just because of luck, but a pretty big percentage is going to survive because they had some favorable trait. Maybe the fish becomes a better swimmer or something of that nature. So individuals with a trait that aids in survival and reproduction will have a better chance of contributing to the next generation. So that means the population will shift. So like in that previous animation, those that appeared to be more camouflaged reproduced and survived. And then the next generation looked more like their parents. So again, over time, the population will shift and change because of that natural selection. As you saw from that animation, they became more camouflaged. All right, so I will continue discussing more in a moment. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, this is just a quick pause in the lecture just to share another way to look at evolution. The idea of vertebrate animals, those that have a backbone, again, they evolved in water as a fish with a backbone, and then a group of fish that could walk on land evolved to become amphibians, and then amphibians that developed scales and able to lay eggs that wouldn't dry out became reptiles. Reptiles, dinosaurs type things had scales that became feathers and then ultimately became birds. And we'll get into more about how all those kind of things may have happened. And then also mammals that had more furry-like elements to them became mammals. Now, what is some of the evidence for that? Well, a lot of it, of course, will come from the fossil record, where we have fossils of fish that had fins that had became more lobe-like for helping crawl onto land. That's some of the evidence. But we also have living species that you could imagine could evolve into something that would become an amphibian. Again, we don't really know the future. We can make some predictions of evolution, but here is a fish that is very comfortable living out of water, that you could imagine, given enough time, could become amphibian-like. The limbs, for instance, the fins, have become very limb-like. It can hold water in its opercular flaps, so it can literally breathe on land and kind of like a scuba tank and walk around for long periods of time, fight each other. So why would something like this evolve? Again, this is where you can use some evolutionary thinking. Maybe it was a way to help go from one petal that was about to dry up because it was a swamp fish, and then move over to another petal before that petal dried up. Maybe it was to find new resources or escape a predator. And moving from one petal could go to another petal. So these are some of the reasons that something like this may have adapted. Now again, there's no guarantee it would have happened. It would have had to been a group of fish that lived in the swamp, and some were able to crawl a little bit better from one petal to another, and they were the ones that left more offspring the next time around. That's how evolution works. It's generation after generation after generation, selecting those that have the adaptations that help them to survive. It's not like the fish chose to develop limbs. It's just the ones that were a little bit more limb-like crawled a little bit better from one petal that was drying up and moving to another petal as a possible reason. So here, if you look at this mud skipper, you can see the fins, and it's actually sitting up on land. It has eyes that can actually dip down and re-moisten itself when they start to dry out. It can hold water in this flap and then walks up on land and can actually have little battles with other mud skippers for territory. But you can see here it's crawling very well. So you can imagine something like this becoming amphibian-like, or this might suggest how amphibians evolved from fish and the first vertebrates to move onto land. Here is a living species today that seems transitional. I'm not saying it's going to become an amphibian or anything like that. But you can see it's certainly a fish that's now learned evolutionarily, in quotes, to take advantage of land resources. Directional selection. So again, the ideas, and this is something you really should put to memory right here, is that variation exists in biological species. It's due to genes and their varieties and making traits that are different. Remember, genes are the blueprints for organisms, that those genes are passed on. Sex is one of the evolutionary ways of increasing diversity in species. I already kind of mentioned this, but all populations over-reproduce. Now, this is why it's kind of important to mention Malthus in the previous stuff, if you go back to the previous presentations. How Malthus, if you remember, influenced Darwin because he was an economist that made the argument that, you know, you're always going to have this population of people that are going to be struggling for resources and for food. And was it a benefit to feeding those people if they're going to reproduce and be an even bigger population struggling for food? So this is where Darwin gets the idea of there's these limited resources, over reproduction of individuals, and they're struggling and striving to get this resource. If you think about it, if all those salmon survived, you know, each salmon's laying thousands of eggs, eventually there would be no space in the lakes and rivers. But the fact that most of the salmon die opens up that space. If all the flies survived, as flies are laying thousands of eggs, and all of them survived, and all those flies laid thousands of eggs, and all of them survived, I mean, the earth would be nothing but covered with flies. So the point is, organisms are throwing out a lot more eggs and individuals that will actually survive or can survive because of limited resources, because of predators and food and needs and energetic needs and so forth. So the idea is that there is some type of struggle to survive. And again, struggle is a loaded term. It doesn't have to necessarily be a fitness term, but there's a limitation on the amount of food available at any given time. There's a limitation on space at any given time and reproductive resources at any given time. So there is a struggle among these individuals. Darwin got this idea in part because of Malthus. Also because, you know, the simple fact is, like, look at this. Down here we see a fungi literally throwing out probably hundreds of thousands of spores. Yet how many will actually become another fungus ball? Most offspring will not survive, particularly in our selected individuals that throw out thousands of eggs. Even in humans, we are a prime example of case-selected animal, meaning that we put a lot of child care in. Other animals that represent this would be things like elephants, but even us, only so many individuals can survive. There's ultimately going to be only so much space. Now we don't know where that threshold is. Before modern medicine, and we haven't solved all the problems on Earth, it's so easy to get myopic based on what happens in the United States. But even if you look at the history, think about somebody like Abraham Lincoln, that is Illinois' pride and joy. He had several children, or quite a few, 3 or 4 children anyway. 2 or 3, died at childbirth or child age. I mean, most people before modern medicine had a very short lifespan. There was a struggle for survival even in humans. And so, again, I'm kind of going around a little bit, but I'm trying to impress upon you that a lot more potential individuals could be out there, but due to bad circumstances and selection, don't survive and reproduce. So there's a limitation on how many people will make it. And so those individuals that have some trait that helps them to survive better and reproduce are more likely to leave more offspring. And then those traits will show up in the next generation. Again, it's not perfect. Other factors influence evolution too. Luck sometimes is a role in evolution. If I was to walk outside and get shocked by lightning, that has very little to do with whatever genetic traits came to me. It's just really bad luck. You know, being a big guy, maybe I have some genetic propensity towards being a big guy. If you live in an environment where food is a scarcity, having genes that maybe give me a little bit slower metabolism may be a benefit. Obviously, there's other factors involved, but in our modern society, food is overabundant. And that is a new problem for people. So anyway, these are just to get you thinking a little bit. But as shown in the previous video, over time, the population can change. Evolution does not take place in an individual. Evolution takes place in a population where you got a diversity of traits being selected. And then those traits that are most successful reproduce at a higher rate. So like an example, of that cartoon animation a little bit ago, the camouflaged make-believe creature survived and adapted better and better for its environment. A stick insect is an example of extreme adaptation. If you haven't seen a stick insect, it's an insect that looks just like a stick. We'll see some pictures in a little bit. So from those kind of tenets, those 5 tenets that you should memorize and understand, we come up with 2 inferences. In other words, conclusions. Individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of survival. Doesn't have to be a lot. It might just be a few percentage points higher probability of survival. A little bit hairier. If you're, as my example, a mammoth living in the cold. There's something that gives you just a little bit better, gives you just a little bit of an edge. You have a better chance of, have a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment and leaving more offspring with that trait. The other thing is to realize is that there's an unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of unfavorable traits in the population over generations. So that means, again, unequal. So there's something about an individual that gave them an edge to survive a little better, to reproduce at a little bit higher rate. And then multiple generations, those genes show up more often because it's those individuals that succeeded and survived that reproduced. So the population changed. Going back to that animation, when you had lots of different individuals, there was colored ones of various colors, and in this, in that previous cartoon animation I showed you. But the more brown camouflage rock-like ones survived being eaten. The population shifted where you saw more and more of those rock-like animals, better camouflaged animals. Then the environment changed and became more of a rain grassy area. Individuals' traits that had a little bit more green in them survive, and then it becomes more adaptive. So it's unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce. If everything is equal, then there's no evolution. There's no selection. And that sometimes happens as well. So this gets back to the idea of evolution being a theory and a fact. The fact is that we do see fossils of missing links of sorts. But the theory is the ideas of how evolution works. And even that, in those cases, those things are always being fine-tuned. We learn more about genetics. That changes how we perceive evolution. Ideas of evolution have changed over time, where we have some ideas of a gradualism of evolution. In some cases, we have what we call a punctuated equilibrium. 2 different ideas in regards to evolution. And again, natural selection is not the only factor influencing evolution. Sometimes luck is involved as well. The fact that the dinosaurs were likely killed off by an asteroid, ending their reign on Earth, made it possible for mammals to go through this, what they call adaptive radiation, this massive explosion, and they became one of the dominant animals on Earth. Obviously, insects and things like that are the most dominant if you count actual individuals and diversity and species. But likely, if dinosaurs had not gone extinct for the most part, we wouldn't have seen the rise of birds and mammals. And we see this again and again in evolutionary history. Some, again, major, massive extinction takes place, and then given enough evolutionary time, we see another species take place. But the asteroid hitting the Earth was not that was an environmental catastrophe that went beyond. It might have had some natural selection, but it went beyond the kind of the typical natural selection. Maybe being a small mammal with fur on it helped you to survive the environmental changes that took place, or a reptile with feathers. And there are animals that still are around that could have been, basically around in the dinosaur periods. There are prehistoric animals that are still alive. Things like crocodiles are very ancient species that hasn't changed much evolutionarily speaking, for instance. So in science, a theory accounts for many observations and data and attempts to explain and integrate a great variety of phenomena. So evolution helps us to understand vast areas of biology. That's why the reason why we consider it a cornerstone idea. You can't really be much of a biologist unless you get the concept of evolution. It helps us to understand, I've already kind of hit on this, it helps us to understand how bacteria and drug resistance occurs. Helps us to understand lots and lots of stuff. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection integrates diverse areas of biological study and stimulates many new research questions. Again, evolution is a tool for helping us understand, and it puts you in a mindset of adaptation as maybe an explanation, and helps you to develop hypotheses that you can do for your own biological research. Like one of the things I looked at is whether or not, for one of my research questions, whether or not caterpillars spit. You may not realize this, but caterpillars can spit when they eat on plants. And I asked the question, can their spit influence the plant's immune system? If you're familiar with mosquito saliva can suppress your immune system, prevent you from, help it get a blood meal from you. Mosquito saliva injects it into you, temporarily suppressing your immune system, increasing your capillaries from opening up and letting them drink your blood. So I asked the question, well, what about insects that eat plants? Can their saliva do something? And believe it or not, plants have an immune-like system. It's not antibodies and antigens and things like that. But again, why would I think that? Again, putting it in an evolutionary context, that this may be something of value for the caterpillar to eat a plant and survive. When you start putting ideas out there, how does an animal survive? What adaptations do they have? Then you can start asking biological questions, evolutionary questions, to get at new ideas and discoveries. So ongoing research adds to our understanding of evolution. All the time we see research that demonstrates evolution. Even my study where I found that caterpillar spit can suppress plant defenses was an example from an evolutionary context. Well, the caterpillars that could do this had a better chance of surviving feeding on this plant. And so people, at least get you thinking. They're called conjectures, ideas, thoughts. And there's lots and lots and lots of stories of evolution. Even the example, the mud skipper, the crawling on the land. You could imagine evolutionarily how that may have been a trait that was selected for. Might help a fish that lived in a swampy area to get from one petal to another petal before this one dried out. So those that could kind of wiggle and walk without really being able to walk survived and began to wiggle and survive, and they left more offspring to the point where they adapted to the point where they actually spent a big part of their time out of water. You can put that into an evolutionary thought when you think about it. And then you start looking at, look at ducks and geese and other type of waterfowl. You can imagine how they were all related and kind of went their own evolutionary paths. in a family tree kind of way. So again, observations, individuals in a population vary in their heritable characteristics. That means that this is just like the tenets of evolution, just kind of repeated in a little bit different way. Here we have, got an ant. Here we have individuals, and there's a diversity in any population of animals. You know, be talking about a bird population of robins. Some have a brighter red color, some have a little bit duller red color. As males tend to be the colorful ones. Females appear to use what they call sexual selection, where they choose pretty males to mate with. That's an evolutionary idea. Sexual selection does occur in humans, I imagine. It's probably beneficial to have a good game, be a little taller, drive a sports car, make a little bit of money. Those are selective traits for females often. Demonstrate you're smart, you know. Sexual selection, because, you know, organisms want to breed with what they consider evolutionary successful organisms, right? So, because that improves the survival of their offspring. And so, why do male birds so colorful? Why do peacocks have beautiful plumage? Why do the females not as colorful in the world of birds? Because what it says to a female bird, if you're a colorful male and can fly around and survive, it means I got good genes. Look at me, I'm beautiful and I'm not getting eaten by these predators. It means I got it going on. If you can afford a Corvette, it might be, again, signaling that I have lots of resources for your offspring. Why is it not a benefit to the females? I mean, they can stay camouflaged. And males are not as choosy as females. Why are males less choosy? Why are females choosy? Well, it's expensive to raise young. It's expensive to lay eggs. It's expensive to spend 9 months pregnant. Males don't have to do that. They can go off and father many children. So the idea is that males are less choosy. These are evolutionary ideas. So anyway, there's variation in individuals. It's heritable. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive in an environment. Salmon lay thousands of eggs. That's the norm. So some are going to be successful, some are not going to be successful. It's going to be unequal. Some of it's due to dumb luck. Some of it's going to be due to heritable traits that help them to survive in whatever the environment happens to be at that time. And so, again, we infer that individuals that are well suited to the environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. Camouflaged insects that can hide out are better adapted to their environment, leave more offspring than those that stand out and say, eat me, from the birds. And so that over time, these favorable traits accumulate in the population. If you're a stick insect, you survived, you're going to leave more offspring till over time. If all of a sudden trees disappear and you stand out because we live in a concrete jungle, then you better start looking like a rock. And it's not going to necessarily happen. You have to have heritable traits and things that can be selected upon. Evolution, things don't have to evolve. But if that variation doesn't exist, often those species will go extinct. It's easier to see microevolution. Microevolution means evolution in a small period of time. We don't see speciation, meaning it doesn't become a new species. But we can see how a population changes over time. Here's one example of it in mosquitoes. Mosquitoes obviously are a big nuisance, but they're more than a nuisance. In some countries, mosquitoes spread malaria. Malaria is a blood-borne parasite. And that blood-borne parasite can cause some serious problems and can kill people. So getting rid of mosquitoes gets rid of malaria often. And again, not all mosquitoes spread malaria. These are the Anopheles mosquitoes and things like that. Before, during, as you're probably familiar with World War I and stuff like that, people started getting into learning about different types of sprays that could kill people, like mustard gas. Over time, during this kind of period of time, from World War I onward to World War II and so forth, we began developing chemicals that could kill off insects, insecticides. Other ways, we've used more crude methods, but insecticides became much more scientific, and chemistry improved a lot, to the point where we developed an insecticide called DDT. This is very famous. DDT is a very famous insecticide. And it did wonders to kill off pests. Pests, again, are insects or animals or weeds that are things that humans do not like and want. They compete with our food. They can spread diseases. They are unwanted. That's how we define pests as humans. So mosquitoes are pests. Nobody likes to be bit by a mosquito for the most part. That doesn't mean that mosquitoes don't serve a very important ecological purpose. Birds eat them, dragonflies eat them. So they do serve a purpose. Well, purpose is a strong, they do serve a role in nature that goes beyond being a pest to us. But DDT was a way for us to really knock down the mosquitoes. And it got to the point where, and it did, and this is true for other pest species too, even in our crops, like caterpillars would be chewing away and destroying our crops. DDT was used to clear off these pests. And so it looked like a wonder drug. We weren't going to have to deal with mosquitoes anymore. We weren't going to have to deal with pest problems. It was a wonder drug. Now, 2 or 3 things we found out was bad about DDT. One was this ecological. If birds eat animals that have eaten insects that have eaten DDT, eventually we call this bioamplification, where it ended up being this bird of prey, like an eagle, but eat an animal that ate an animal that ate an animal that had eaten another animal that ate the DDT. What happened was the DDT spread in the environment, and the eggs of eagles, for instance, would become very weak and easily cracked, killing the baby eaglets. And so so it was having a very bad effect on the ecosystem. That's one problem. But here's the other thing about evolution. This is where evolution kicks in again, in the world of microevolution. What I found was when you spread this insecticide, you got this population of mosquitoes. Most of the mosquitoes died because you spread this DDT. Great. We're cured. But the problem was there was a handful of mosquitoes in that big population, because there's some that show resistance to insecticides better than others. Just like humans, right? Some humans got a little bit better immune system than others. And so when we killed off the mosquitoes with without the ability to resist, I hate using the word weak immune system, it's oversimplifying, but they had a physiology that could not withstand DDT, this pesticide, they were wiped out. But the mosquitoes that had something about their traits, future differences in how their proteins were shaped, whatever, made them more resistant to DDT. They had something about their physiology and their immune-like system that made them more resistant to DDT. So who survives after that first massive reduction? Those that showed a little bit more resistance. They are the ones reproducing. They're the individuals that survive. So what does the population start to look like 2 or 3 generations later? They show more and more resistance to DDT. The population becomes more resistant to DDT. And that's what's shown in this graph here, you know, where they're spreading, initially when they spread this DDT, 96% of the mosquitoes were killed, only 4% survived. That's the resistant population. That's what they found. 4% of the population showed resistance to DDT naturally. They had something in their genes that gave them the trait that gave them more resistance. They survive, they reproduce. What do we see 8 months later? Almost half the population shows resistance to DDT. What do we see in 12 months? 77% show resistance to DDT. This is massive. This is evolution. This is evolution. The mosquitoes now are resistant to DDT. It's no longer effective. And we see this time and time again with insecticides in general. We see this in antibiotic resistance in us. We kill off the weak bacteria, but the strong bacteria survive and they reproduce. Again, weak is a loaded term, but the weak mosquitoes were killed off. The strong mosquitoes survived. What do we see? The genes passed on for resistance. And I'm using loaded terms, weak and strong. I'm talking about a trait that made the mosquito more resistant to DDT, surviving. And then the future population is made up of those individuals that survived. That is a type of natural selection. Granted, it was human driven, right? Because we put this insecticide out there, but it's not like artificial selection where you're purposely choosing that trait. This was just an example of one study. There's been lots of studies that showed insecticide resistance. And so that's what's shown in this graph here, where you can see the percentage of resistant mosquitoes increased over time. As I mentioned before, Darwin was influenced by the work of Thomas Malthus, who was a economic person, economics type person back in his day. I'm not sure what they'd call him exactly. And he noted that the potential for the human population could increase indefinitely, while the ability to feed people may become limited. This helped make Darwin think about these ideas of evolution. Do we really know that for a fact? It seems like we could run into a problem with population, right? You know, when I was born, we were talking about 3 or 4 billion people. Now we're talking, what, 10 or 12 billion people? How far can we go before we have, you know, some severe problems? I'd start arguing that we are having environmental problems now. We've found good ways to maximize food production. You just look outside when you drive to Chicago and you see all that corn, even though we're not eating it directly, it goes to mostly to feeding cattle and other things. The corn that you see and corn oil and whatever, but we're maximizing the amount of food that we can generate on land, but that's still causing an environmental issue, right? Because that's agro-ecosystem. That's not a natural diversity system. but people seem to, in our modern society, have fewer and fewer children and have them later in life. And it seems maybe this is kind of our way of controlling population. I don't know. But there would be all sorts of cultural explanations as well. But it became a big enough problem that some countries like China enforced a one-child rule. So anyway, I digress a little bit, but the point is Thomas Malthus helped influence Darwin's ideas, and I showed you that in that timeline map a lecture or two ago. And so again, Darwin sees this in organisms and that some heritable traits are advantageous. If you're a mosquito with a little bit more resistance to DDT, that's it's an advantage. If you live in an environment where DDT is being spread by humans, what happens when we stop spreading DDT? It may not be an advantage anymore. Maybe the advantage of being the wild population gives you that mosquito a different trait that gives it a better chance of survival than the ones that have that resistance trait. But anyway, this adaptation is the process this natural selection is the process that explains the match between the organism and the environment, this adaptation. And so here's examples of adaptation that become quite extreme. Here are two examples of praying mantis. You've probably seen praying mantis around here if you looked outside. They kind of stick-like. But look how strong this selection can be. Now remember, praying mantis are predators. They like to grab on and with their long forearms, for the lack of a better term right at this moment, raptorial arms is what I think they call them. They can squeeze on like this and eat their prey. When a male mates with a female praying mantis, they often lose their head while they're mating, and then the female eats the rest of the male while he's doing his thing, so to speak. Look how extreme the selection is. If you look at the top picture, you might not have picked it out right away. This isn't just a flower. This is a praying mantis. Look at this is the praying mantis. This is the eyes. This is the antenna. This is the body. Found in Malaysia. Why this extreme? I mean, this is an insect that has an extremely adapted trait for living on these plants. It helps it to hide from animals it wants to eat, and it helps it to hide from animals that want to eat it, right? Look at this one, looks like a stick. And there are stick insects, I keep saying over and over again. Look how similar it is to the plant that it lives on, extreme adaptations. If I was to take this praying mantis and throw it on that stick, it would be a terrible adaptation. And likewise, if I was to put this on that plant, it would not be as good of an adaptation either. Both of these individuals probably lay, a bell-shaped curve of some that look more similar to the stick and a little bit less similar to stick, or plant, flowers. And those that look more like the flower survived and reproduced and had an offspring that looked like flowers and reproduced and goes on and on for thousands and millions of generations. So again, individuals with a certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Natural selection increases the adaptation of the organism to their environment over time. If an environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions. So like in that previous animation, that cartoon, when we went from a desert environment to a grassy environment, the animals adapted to the new environment. Note that individuals that do not evolve, populations evolve. It's not the individuals that are choosing to become something different. It's not Lamarckian evolution. Remember, Lamarck thought if you work out or stretch your neck, then you will evolve and change. It doesn't work that way. It's the population of individuals, and those that have the traits survive and reproduce that are needed. Natural selection can increase or decrease these heritable traits. In the case of DDT, natural selection selected for resistance in that population, so increased that trait. Or in the case of praying mantises, if you don't look like a stick, those individuals that don't look like a stick disappear over time. So adaptations vary with different environments. If you live in a snow environment, you're going to adapt or go extinct in that snow environment, and desert environment, and so forth. Environments change, and you have to have the traits to survive. So we have some different types of selection. So natural selection thinks about things as a bell curve, a bell shape. What I mean by a bell shape, if I was to measure the individuals in my class or on the human spectrum, we know that the average height is around 5'9" around the world. So a typical guy is probably somewhere between 5'7" and 6'2". Then you start going to extremes, 5 foot, 7 foot, and they're way down here. A lot less individuals, and I'll show you a picture of that. Remember, evolution takes place on a population. So let me show you some pictures that help you to understand that a little bit better. So we can call these different types of natural selection either stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, or directional selection. This will make sense in a moment, but stabilizing selections eliminates extremes. So if you're talking about a population, most people are up here, this average height, if we're talking about a bell curve, at the extremes, the really tall and the very short get selected away. Disruptive selection eliminates the intermediate. That means anybody in the middle would be selected against the average height people. These are just trying to give you an idea to visualize. It'll make more sense when I show you a graph, so just be patient if you're a little bit confused. And then we have directional selection. This is selection that takes place where an extreme phenotype is selected. So maybe just really tall or really short are selected for. So let me give you some examples of these. So here's our bell curves. And again, this is the look at this graph. This is the number of individuals. Number of individuals. This is body size or height. This is the middle graph. So again, we're using height just to explain a bell graph. Here would be the average height of a guy around 5'9". Then we got 5'7" to 6'2". Over here we got 7 foot and taller. Over here we have 5 foot and under. Those are extremes. If there was something in the environment that was selecting where the average height person was the preferred evolutionary trait, we would call that stabilizing selection. And that means the extremes would be selected against. We'll come up with I'll give you examples of this in a moment. Then we have disruptive selection. This is where the average height people are being selected against, and the extremes, the really tall and the really short, are being selected. And then we have directional selection. In this case, one extreme is being selected, either really tall, or you could have it going the other way. That's not shown here, they're really short. Those would be examples of directional selection. So these are the 3 different kinds of natural selection. big beaks. If you want to imagine it from a bird's perspective, and selecting for extreme big beaks in regards to the birds of Galapagos, for instance. So anyway, let me show you some other examples of that. This is in regards to humans, stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is based on baby weights. What is the average baby weight? Well, the average baby weight is around 6 or 7 pounds. And so a typical baby weighs around 6 or 7 pounds. And think about it, what is the limitations on baby weight? Well, one of them is going to be mothers, right? Mothers can only maximize how many the size of baby they can deliver. I mean, obviously we have the ability to do C-sections and things like that, but remember, modern medicine really wasn't, I mean, one of the most dangerous things a woman did, particularly a couple hundred years ago, was to give birth. A really large baby could kill the mother and the baby. Couldn't get out, cause all sorts of complications. Too small of a baby, a preemie kind of size baby, is also very bad. The baby's not likely to survive, particularly a couple hundred years ago when modern medicine was really bad. So again, what is the just right baby? Around 6 or 7 pounds. They had the highest degree of survival. The mothers had the highest degree of survival. So that is a stabilizing selection. The extremes, the really big babies and the little babies, were selected against, evolutionarily speaking. So that's an example of stabilizing selection. Again, this is the frequency. And this isn't just in babies. We could talk about chicken eggs doing the same thing. Extreme eggs results in chicken hens that can't lay the eggs. Really small eggs results in not very good little chicks. It's that middle ground. So that's stabilizing selection. Now, disruptive selection, again, is choosing extremes. So here is an example of African seed cracker finches. In this case, the extremes are being selected. The middle-sized beaks are being selected against. So either really big beaks or really small beaks are being selected for, because the little beaks can handle the little seeds and eat them. The big beaks can crack a seed, but the middle beaks are not very good at either one of those. So this is an example of called disruptive selection. Again, disruptive selection, the extremes are being picked. Either the big beaks or the little beaks are being selected. So you can see how stabilizing selection got rid of the big eggs and the little eggs, or the big babies and the little babies. It was the intermediates that survived. That's stabilizing. Disruptive. Big beaks, small beaks do well. The middle beaks don't do well. Now, directional selection is selecting in a direction. In the case of the DDT, we were directionally selecting mosquitoes to show resistance to DDT. Or we're selecting Drosophila is another example. Drosophila are famous in biology. They're fruit flies where we've learned incredible amounts about genetics. So we can study the genetics of fruit flies and have an idea of how the genetics in all organisms work. So they did an experiment where they looked at flies moving towards the light, because flies like to, as you've seen the house flies, they like to fly in the light. but some flies like to fly to light more than other flies. And so there's a frequency of flies flying towards the light. So the average, so what they did was when a fly would fly towards the light, they would kill it. Those that didn't really fly to the light very much were allowed to reproduce. And what they found after several generations, up to 18, that the tendency to go towards light had disappeared from the population dramatically, dropped 70% or so from this picture here. And that was after 20 short generations. That's directional selection. So remember, evolution isn't just selecting for physical traits. Evolution is also affecting selection of traits that influence behavior and the mind. Here's another example of directional selection depending on pre- and post-industrial revolution. The idea is that there's this peppered moth, and before the Industrial Revolution, the trees around England have a kind of a white bark. So these moths are the same species, and the whiter moth of that species survived and was camouflaged better than the darker moth. So birds would eat the darker moth. And then during the Industrial Revolution, there wasn't the kind of controls that we have today. Huge amounts of carbon pollution was going around, covering up the trees with soot. So the bark was no longer white in color. And in doing so, the pepper moth actually started being selected, the white pepper moth started being selected against because now the bark was being covered with dark soot from the coal burning plants, putting a lot of smoke out. And now the white colored moth was being picked away by the bird. So after 50 or 60 years, the pepper moth population had shifted. It went from being predominantly made up of white colored moths to being primarily made up of dark colored moths. So again, here's an example of selection taking place over the course of 40 or 50 years. So what you've seen has been primarily examples of microevolution. These are evolutionary changes that take place on a small scale. When the mosquitoes became resistant to DDT, we were talking about microevolution. When the babies are being selected for stabilizing selection, we're talking about microevolution. But macroevolution is speciation. Now, even people that are creationists, meaning that they don't really fully buy into evolution, still will usually accept microevolution. They will accept that insecticide resistance occurs, but then they'll say, oh, but speciation can't happen. The creationist, again, is usually the idea that all species are fixated and have not changed. But they will usually accept microevolution, meaning that the population has changed and you see a more resistance gene, like in the case of DDT or even the moth. But I make the argument, if you can accept a small amount of evolution, you can accept a small amount of snowfall, but you can't accept a big amount of snowfall. That's where I'm a little confused. If you can accept a little bit of evolution, is it really that big of a step to imagine over 1 million years, things changing quite a bit more? What kind of evidence do we have for macroevolution? Obviously, the biggest place to look is the fossil record. So what kind of evidence do we have for evolution? It's the fossil record. It's the anatomical record. It's the molecular record. So I think that's a good place to leave for this lecture. Let me see if I can find a fun way to wrap up this video, and then I'll tell you what I'd like for a summary. All right, so here's the video that I'm going to share with you. It's short, to give you some ideas about selection, again, natural selection, and the 3 different types of natural selection. She talks about the Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium, and I haven't really got into that yet. Again, don't let big names like this intimidate you. The Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium, just for a short, quick 2-second synopsis of it, is the different things that are needed for evolution to take place. And if everything's in an equilibrium, we don't have evolution. So again, I'm not going to be able to do it's explained through an equation and a few other things, but the idea is, for instance, if random selection was taking place or random breeding was taking place, then you wouldn't have evolution. So if everybody randomly reproduced with anybody else and there was no selection of who was breeding with who or who was surviving, everybody had an equal chance of survival, equal chance of reproduction, then you don't have evolution. So, but we know that the environment usually does not allow for that. And so when that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is disrupted, we have this evolution taking place. And that's the norm, right? I mean, most things are going to have some type of selective pressure. In the case of mosquitoes and humans, the DDT was a selective pressure. Birds is another type of selective pressure on mosquitoes, and dragonflies and so forth. There's all sorts of things, just for one example. So anyway, I've already talked about the 3 different types of selection. Here's another recap of that. I think they're pretty interesting ones. That's why I'm including them.
When Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is broken, evolution in the population will occur. When the pressures are from the environment, it's called natural selection.
Remember, evolution and natural selection is just one of the processes of evolution. It does not have to be just, let me make sure I'm recording.